I titled the presentation A Dog-Centered Approach, and I've tried really consciously to always mention the dog's name in my writing about this project as well, in order for myself to try and focus even more on what role does this specific animal play in establishing specific relationships that improve human well-being. And I've been very motivated by some of the work that was produced by animal geographers, among whom Chris Bear, we just talked about him 15 minutes ago. He wrote an article about an octopus, and it's called Being Angelica. And he argues that although we know a lot about relationships between people and animals, animals still don't really play a major role. So he tried to bring that to our attention by writing centrally about one particular octopus and its relationship with the visitors to the aquarium, and named it Angelica. The octopus was probably already called Angelica. So in my work on aging, we've done some work in public spaces in urban neighborhoods, but also work in residential care homes and nursing homes. And there were a few issues that were very striking. These are some of the topics that we studied there, people's mobility, how people related to each other and to themselves, trying to always not be the kind of person that is supposed to live in an old people's home because they were not really as old and fragile as everyone else who lived there. So a strong sense of resisting old age and avoidance, but also a sense of a loss of agency and a loss of bodily control. And this is quite interesting when we're thinking about care relationships and bringing in animals, because loss of agency and bodily control can also translate into unintended reactions by staff. So they can respond to the smell of excrements or other kind of bodily fluids that people involuntarily lose. They can respond negatively, even though they don't mean to loss of control, to people falling asleep or having angry outbursts. And that can make the residents of nursing homes feel inadequate and lose self-esteem. And through this work that did not involve dogs, I've become really interested in how can you improve this care relationship by introducing an element that doesn't care about how people smell or how they look and if they have hair or not, and how they respond in interpersonal relationships. So in the literature, the age group that we find in nursing homes is sort of theorized as the fourth age. The third age is often related to people who are still trying to push that boundary back of being really, really old, and people who try to still be active and maintain a lot of their everyday activities and social agency. But the fourth age is really when you're that close to death, actually. And it often involves some kind of institutionalization, and it can vary, of course, depending on the quality of the nursing home, but people are still bound by the rules and regulations and rhythms in an institution, which means that at certain times, every day, every week, there's things like coffee, activities, dinners, visitation, and so forth. And a lot of people enter these nursing homes involuntarily when something bad has happened and they have broken a hip and cannot be cared for, or they're single, have no children, and something happens, so they need institutional care. Often this leads to, well, I already mentioned, loss of self-esteem, agency, isolation, boredom, and awkward relationships within the care home. So this is a very long quote from one of the articles, but many of these articles really highlight the institutional character of aging and how it is really a very bad place, even though people all try to work on creating a home, but people rather not be there. So you see the same terminology, idleness, it's boring, people are lonely, people get depressed and experience generally a low quality of life. But some research also shows that activities can temporarily bring people sort of back to life and improve their physical ability, because people are participating in games or in crosswords and so forth. And in particular, working with pets as part of recreational programs has demonstrated some really good results in giving people a sense of control, people even using fewer medications because they have better blood pressure levels and so forth. So this is, in addition to the literature that I just very briefly mentioned, is the context in which the study has to be seen. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with animal-assisted therapy and animal-assisted activities, well, strictly speaking, the study that we did was not with a therapy dog, although everyone referred to the dog as a therapy dog. Strictly speaking, animal-assisted therapy is an intervention that is the result of a therapeutic plan. And the person going along with the dog has to be a credentialed therapist. So any volunteers who enter an institution with a dog, and they might do exactly the same things as the therapist, are qualified as animal-assisted activities. So in the literature, you find that there's a lot of benefits related to animal-assisted therapy. Only the studies are conducted from a particular perspective. A lot of the animal-assisted therapy studies come from the medical sciences, and that translates into a particular focus in what are they actually looking for when they're looking at well-being issues, and how are they measuring well-being issues. So often the studies use selection criteria for the respondents. So they will have, in an institution of, 60 people, they will select 20 people by certain criteria. So they have to be, they cannot be suffering from dementia. They have to have certain mobilities. They have to have certain abilities and maybe a certain age group and so forth. And these people receive either a scripted or free interaction with the dog. And scripted means that they have to do certain interactions. They have to play with the ball, they have to, go for a walk. So there's different things that the researchers preconceive that the respondent has to do with the dog. And the dog can either be loose, so walking around by himself, or can be leashed. Another thing is, I just said something about measurement, is respondents are required to fill out surveys before the intervention and after the intervention, and comment on the contact moments with the dog. And they have these standardized inventories, and I put a few there: the mini mental state examination, the Beck depression inventory, and self-perceived quality of life. And it's important to realize that you can only do these things if people actually are still able to communicate in that way and understand what the survey means. That was not the case in our study, so we didn't do surveys that respondents themselves could fill out. The outcome of these studies are still relatively similar to what we found as well. And there's a summary here. More and longer socialization behaviors are displayed by the respondents in interaction with the animal, such as leans, smiles, looking towards the dog, stroking the dog, cuddling the dog, discussing things with the dog, like the looks of the dog, or giving the dog instructions and so forth. Incidentally, the images that you see here are not from the medical studies, but they are all already images from the study that we undertook. So I tried to sneak in as many as I could to give you an impression of what is happening in the nursing home. It's like in the past, I think they had these experiments where you were watching a movie and you had Coca-Cola bottles sort of displayed in between, and at the end everyone felt they really wanted to have a bottle of Coke. So maybe after this you really need to see a dog, but I can't provide for that, unfortunately. The studies also found significant improvement in cognitive functions, motivational and emotional aspects, so all indicative of improved quality of life for nursing home residents. And I will give you some qualitative information about that in a moment. So there were some measurements of people's saliva as well, where they were looking for specific biochemical responses, and all of these basically reduce stress and increase joy. And it was very interesting. I found one article that also showed that the same thing happened with the dogs. So in the human-dog interaction in the nursing home, the people felt happier, but the dogs also felt happier. So actually it would be a great argument to bring in more dogs, because in terms of treating other species better, this might help with that as well. And we can certainly attest to that. This dog seemed very happy, as you can probably see in the pictures later on. So nevertheless, in none of these studies, it actually mattered who the dog was. It was always just a dog, which could have just as well been translated into a flashcard in a different experiment. It didn't matter that the dog brought a particular agency with him or her. So the exact breed of the dog, which translates into size or color or structure of the hair or amount of saliva that's produced, wasn't really taken into consideration. So I was wondering, how does actually this particular dog and its dogness help enhance human well-being? So I was looking at, in the interaction between the dog and the human, how was the sense of space and time changed, and what is the personalized approach? So how does Alvin work with people in a way that responds to the specific needs and abilities of the people, and establish relationships because of the particular thing that he does? And then later on, I'll briefly talk about why does Alvin do what he does. So that really is about dog behavior. What is I'll be looking at things like co-evolution and stuff like that. So then, how did we do this study? We did various observations of Alvin, and we also actively participated in the work with the dog and the residents, which meant that we went along with him and helped put a chair under his butt and put a sheet over the chair, and maybe help people with food morsels. They were all given some treat so they could do either tricks with it or feed him or whatever they fancied, really. And we also conducted several visits without the dog on different days of the week and different times of the day to get a sense of what the nursing home normally looked like and what people did in their everyday interactions. Or did they do anything at all? Did they talk to each other? Did they just sit and look out of the window? Did they recognize me, for instance, if I came without the dog? Or was I really not very significant at all? We had access to, now actually is a good moment to, so if someone starts snoring, I'll put the light on again, but for now I think it's useful to be able to see the images. We had access to 902 photographs that were taken of Alvin's work over the years. And what we did was we analyzed them by people that were visible on the pictures. So we had folders of each of the residents that could be seen in pictures. And we could see over the years how the interaction between the dog and the human evolved and what kind of personal stories we could detect. And we could also see sequences of behavior, like the one down at the bottom here is a sequence, and it has many more pictures where it's almost like a little movie where you can see how the human relates to the dog, how she instructs him, how she strokes him, how she tells him jokes, and so forth. We also wanted to understand Alvin's particular dogness and his qualifications that he brought into this relationship. So we also talked to his owner about his training as a puppy, and you saw a picture earlier already. The training also involved teaching by other dogs. And we also visited the dog school and conducted some basic training activities ourselves, just to get a sense of how can we help the dog interact with other people using nonverbal cues. We also held interviews. I wanted to say tried to, because really with the residents, I said 9 interviews of about 30 minutes, but they are of very different quality. The residents really were very difficult to talk to. Their answers were very short. They couldn't remember very well, so we used photographs to try and stimulate their memory, but they couldn't remember really very well what the exact interaction was. But the positive thing was that they always were stimulated to talk about incidences in the past where they had experienced something with other animals in their previous lives. So we could see a relationship already there between the interaction with the dog and their biographical work. But the most useful data really for looking at what's happening between dog and human was with the observations and the photographs. We also conducted interviews with members of staff. Members of staff are regularly filling out well-being surveys where they're observing residents and scoring certain behaviors to assess well-being, and they were able to tell us also how the dog impacted the different aspects on the survey. So these are some of the quotes that I extracted from the transcripts from people in the nursing home, and throughout the presentation, when the quotes have this shape, they are said by staff in the nursing home, and when they're little clouds, it's residents saying it. So just so you can differentiate. And you see already that the mission of the nursing home is really to provide a homely nursing home where people have good self-esteem, have some kind of ability to look after themselves within their capacities. So they all talk about it's really great, and we work with the residents and the relatives, and it's very friendly, but also encountering stress just because of the rigidity of the schedule. But the residents they are sort of content, but also sort of not. One respondent says it's fine, but I'd rather be home, and she doesn't realize that she'll be there basically until she dies. So she says it's only for a short time. And another one says, I don't really like anything, I just want to go home. And the third one complains about she wants to do this and she wants to do that, but as soon as she turns around, people start tidying up behind her. So again, she feels very much out of place. So although people are relatively content, there is a difference in conception between what the nursing home means for the people who work there and for the people who live there. I just wanted to show you a schedule. I talked about institutionalization before, and although that term has been criticized for nursing homes nowadays, there still are a lot of elements in nursing homes that have institutional character with consequences for the residents, simply because it's that how people need to work. They cannot work in such a place if they don't do things in a structured way. But you can see here that, and as I said, they refer to as therapy dogs. The dogs are a regular part of the schedule. The schedule is it's hung up in all the different corridors. So people, if they forget which day is the day when the dogs come again, they can see it's always on Tuesday morning. So they can look forward to and take their position already on a Tuesday morning, so they're ready for when the dogs arrive. And I want to say a few things about Alvin, since he's the main character in this talk. You could already see on the pictures that he's a Bernese mountain dog. So he's really very big, and he's very furry, and he produces a lot of saliva, and that's not insignificant in the relationship and how people like him or not. At the time of the observations, he was 4 years old. And one thing to highlight, perhaps, is that he's been working, or he's been doing child labor already since the age of 4 months. And it is significant because a lot of the animal-assisted therapy literature suggests that dogs should be at least a year or a year and a half and have conducted basic obedience training. But Alvin's owner feels that it is actually the early months that are the most formative for dog behavior in a positive and a negative way. So if you can provide the dog with a lot of positive stimulus, then he will be able to work better with the different groups at an older age. And for dogs, for instance, it translates into things like, where can you touch the dog? A lot of dogs don't like to be touched on the head, and it's a lot of work to get a dog to accept it. So in this relationship, that was already done at a relatively young age, so that the dog would tolerate being petted on the head, because that's the way that many people approach dogs. They will first go like that rather than approach him from the side or so. The dog has also experience working with children of all ages. He does training with helping children to get over fear of dogs, and he also works in institution for people with cognitive impairments. So this is how he's described by people in the nursing home. Again, the round clouds are staff, and the cloudy clouds are residents. So I guess there's a lot of agreement that it's a great dog. He's well trained. There are other dogs also who visit the nursing home, but this is definitely one of the favorite ones. There's also a realization here that he is a trained dog, so some people are aware of the fact that he isn't just there to be friends, but he's also there to do his job. Alvin is clicker trained. I don't know if you are familiar with it. The clicker, it's this thing. It's like when you were a kid, you had these little frogs or crocodiles that went like click clack. And in dog training, these are used to reward a specific behavior of a dog. And usually it's done not only in the dog school, but in people's everyday lives. So if you want a dog to walk next to you with a loose leash, every time that the dog does it, you will use the clicker and give the dog a treat. So the dog will associate the treat with that very specific behavior. For working in care situations, it means eventually that the dog can be instructed via nonverbal cues, and that's important because it means that the human who follows the dog along doesn't have to say things like sit, go, here, and it's very disturbing in trying to establish a relationship between the nursing home resident and the dog. So all the owner has to do is to point somewhere, and the dog will respond. It also means that the dog is very attentive to the owner, so he'll always look for cues from his owner. I have a little clip. I'm showing you this clip. It's a clip from the dog school, and it shows that in teaching the dog a specific behavior, the human has to think like a dog. And I think this clip shows it quite well. You see a research master student who came along as part of the study to assist with the observations. And you see how she first does her own approach, and then she does the dog-like approach, and it works a lot better. So you see she sort of has a hierarchy thing going. I'll be walking here, you'll be doing your thing there. And the dog is supposed to slowly walk through each of the barriers step by step, and he just sort of went through it. And now you see the dog owner and dog school owner as well, showing the dog step by step. And it's interesting because in thinking about the work in the nursing home, you need to see the dog as not just operating in a vacuum, but as a part of a network of different relationships that involve other humans as well. And the way that the relationship with his carer has evolved, where the carer is also sort of thinking like a dog in his training, is really important for how this translates into the quality of relationships in the nursing home. And you see here also that the dog has a lot of humor, because as soon as he gets the chance, he will take over and make humans do what he actually wants them to do. And he does that in any situation. So you can see how relationships with dogs, where they are asked to do something, can give them also positive experience, because they are rewarded by attention or food morsels. Then, well, as I said, Alvin is the central character here, so it's also important to think about what the rituals and routines are for the dog on the days that he works in the nursing home. Because it's not a regular dog, and there are actually very many cues and items that tell the dog from the moment that he wakes up, oh yeah, today is the day that I'll be working at the nursing home. So, there's a clip here as well. This is not actually something that happens every day like this when he works at the nursing home, but it's just symbolic for that he's really very, very well groomed. And the reason why he's very well groomed is because he doesn't smell as much, so it sort of takes away the really doggy smell, and he also feels very, very soft. So it's really done to promote the relationship between human and animal. So every morning he is more than usually groomed. He's often walked earlier dependent on the weather, so that he's not wet or muddy. And he also wears a different collar and leash than on his normal days out. So you saw maybe already in other pictures that he's wearing sort of like almost like a jacket, but he has even a different leash around his neck, collar, and a special leash of a certain length and color that he can recognize as indicative of today's my work day. He's also not fed in the morning, because one of the reasons why he works so well is because that he's fed actually during his activities with the humans, and then when he comes back, he's given a fresh bone as a treat. And then also important to mention that basically the rest of the day he's off and he can hang out and rest. It's very, very intensive for a dog to work there, and the owners are very attentive to cues of the dog. So if there's changes in the nursing home, if there are new residents, if one of the other dogs doesn't show up and Alvin has to take over another unit, they will always stay shorter, because the dog feels the stress and then also cannot interact properly with the other humans. So, a day at work. When Alvin enters the nursing home, he has specific units that he works at, and another dog, a white Alsatian, works at other units. And basically the ritual is that as soon as he walks up the stairs, he is unleashed and he can enter the common room by himself. And often people have already positioned themselves there if they want to interact with the dog. And one of the staff describes this interaction like this. The dog goes to the residents, he says hello by giving them a nudge with his nose or gives them a paw, and the residents are quite taken with him. The fact that a dog is coming here, they have a lot of fun. And you can see this here as well. And it's relevant because usually they don't. Usually they don't laugh so much, and they don't talk to each other. Not about the dog since it's not there, and they don't laugh either. So there are some people there who never talk except for when the dog is there. There's some hygiene considerations bringing in a big dog like that, and there are the institutional perspective is that a sheet has to be used on any surface where the dog lies, and he cannot be in a linen room or anywhere near food preparation. But the everyday practice is that wherever the dog wants to go and people want to interact with him, he can go. So here you see that there is a sheet on the chair, but you will also see pictures where the dog is lying on the bed of a resident, and then the nurse will stand by the door and check. Oh, is whatever the name is of the person who's in charge of hygiene. No, she's not coming. No, it's fine, you can stay there. Oh, no, she comes. Dog has to get off the bed. So that's how it really works. But so there is a sense of a necessity for hygiene, and the nurses obviously know which residents maybe are more fragile or prone to allergies. But there's a lot of sort of working like this. And you also see some shots of where the dog is sitting like this, and next to him people are cutting potatoes. So in this particular instance, there's a lot of flexibility. Then another quote from a member of staff: "He's very calm and yet very expressive. The best thing is when he sits on a chair next to the residents. That's a real picture, really great. And the cuddling and with a snout in one's neck. And then he'll get a treat." So you see that in the interaction, this me sitting there in part of the participant observation, what we do is we have the treats, and if the residents want to feel the dog but are unable to move down to the dog, even when they're sitting on the chair, we'll put the food sort of behind their head, and then the dog can touch their faces. And many people ask for this, even though he's really big and has large teeth as well. And they really enjoy feeling the softness on their cheek. And this woman, she is one of the people who basically sit at the table on a chair most of the day, and she communicates by sort of clacking noises. And I talked earlier about this thing of abjection and disgust, and a lot of the staff find it very irritating that she makes those noises all day. So maybe you can imagine that even if you try to be really nice to the person, if it's sort of affect is when you respond to something without maybe consciously doing it. So it can impact a relationship negatively, but that's not the case for the dog. As long as the dog receives his strokes and cuddles and the treats, and the people spends time with him, then he'll think it's great. The dog also has an important role for the members of staff. A lot of members of staff talk about stress, and they really appreciate also having some time with the dog. And the relationship between the members of staff and the dog is quite different. I will show a few more images and talk about specific relationships between the dog and the residents. But with members of staff, it's usually the dog thinks, yippee, now I can go all loose, and he throws himself on the floor on people's feet so they can't go anywhere except for pay attention to the dog. And there's a few residents like this woman who are mobile enough to also participate in this, and so they'll really give him a good all-over body massage, but often that's not the case with the residents. So most of the people that we spoke to, members of staff, also felt a sense of relief and sort of happiness and relaxation when the dog was there. Earlier on, I talked about literature on nursing homes that talked about social isolation, loss of self-esteem, and loss of agency. And sometimes people express agency in very annoying ways. Like this woman, she claimed a sofa, and she wouldn't let anyone sit on the sofa, and she would get really grumpy, and people didn't really like her very much. But when the dog was there, the dog could sit on the sofa with her, and when the dog was sitting on the sofa with her, other people could also join them. So this member of staff says, there's a resident who claims a sofa, and she can be really unpleasant when someone else sits there. But she allowed the dog to join her, and that's really unusual, that someone may sit there at all because it's her sofa. So he'll sit there and she'll give him treats and it really works. She's occupied with the dog. And then when the dog leaves, she will still be sort of elevated and talk about the dog and allow people to share her space. Another observation from a member of staff: when the dog comes, his eyes, and that's the residents, are wide open, relaxed, really loose, I'd say. He watches and strokes. For him, it's great. He's usually tense. When the dog is here, he's able to say a few words. Because of his illness, how can I say, he's temperamental, unhappy, or he's screaming about what displeases him. And when the dog is here, then he's relaxed. And this is the woman who likes to have the dog on her bed. She doesn't like to leave her room, a member of staff says. The connection with the dog, that's her connection to the outside world, her only connection to the outside world. And so in this case, when there's time, also Alvin will spend a lot of time just visiting her in her room and, sitting on the bed, cuddling, and she'll be talking to him about how great he is and how nice he feels and stories of her past. And then you see interaction between residents, something that was also already mentioned before in the medical studies. It's a real positive experience for the residents here. They talk about the dogs being here. That's great, and what Alvin did, and all the things you can do, and that's the reason they talk. Here on my unit, a member of staff says, that's really limited, communicating with each other otherwise. And this is the descriptions from residents that we talked to. As I said, they were quite limited, but this is what some of the people said. I like the tenderness. Some people really miss the sort of physical sensation of human interaction. They don't have partners, so there's no romantic relationships, and often there's not much time with the staff. Sometimes they don't have any family who visit them. So the tactile experiences of these people, the realization that they have a body that can feel, is often lacking. So that is what this respondent is referring to, the tenderness, and she actually gets quite emotional when she talks about it. Then someone says, when the dog is not here, I just sit around. Well, mentally, one grows dull. And another feels more alive, happier. And a next one says it's liberating when the dog is there. So you have a sense of being trapped, maybe, not just in one's body, but also in the location of the nursing home. And when the dog is there, as you saw in the previous slide, it's a sort of a bridge to an outside world and to a past. So I want to show you 3 examples of specific relationships between the dog and the resident that shows that the dog does matter, and it's not just the case of a scripted interaction where we do the thing with the food treats, or we do the sitting on the chair, or the cuddling or scratching or something like that. The dog adapts to the people in question. So the relationship between these two we sort of named a love affair, because the woman, we will call her Miss Gwen here, she really talked to the dog as if he was her lover. The kind of words that she was using and the sort of physical closeness. And it's interesting, in the analysis of the photographs, you could see that the photographer was also enchanted by this relationship, because a lot of the pictures are close-ups. So you can really see the face of the dog and the face of the woman. And so she had this sort of teasing relationship where she would play with the treats and line them up on the table, but not allow the dog to eat them, and then sort of look at him and talk to them, and then push one over, and then he would look at her and at the food morsel and at her, and then eventually would say, all right, you can have one. And she did this at the table, or she did this when she was walking with her walker, and then he would encounter her in the hallway, and then she would put the food morsels on her walker and do the same thing. And it's always this sort of loving relationship between the two, and often seated next to her on a chair. And then this particular woman, she always played hide and seek with the dog, and she got very excited by this. So she was given these treats, and then she would put her hands behind her back and put the treat in one hand, and then she would sit there, look at the dog, and look at her hands, look at the dog, and the dog would look at her and look at her hands and look at her, because he's trying to figure out, where did you hide this thing? And so they could go on and on and on. You see that they have a sheet also, but he's sitting next to her at the same height. And I guess it's a nice picture because you can see the facial expressions of how they're playing this game. And it's interesting, I just mentioned the close-up situations with the previous resident, and you see in this relationship, and there's other pictures as well, where you have more of an overview where you can see the full body interaction. And again, that's over the years that we analyzed the photographs, these two were always more or less like this. This woman was a bit more mobile, so she was also able to have him on the floor and give him the full body rub. And she commented on how well she knew the dog and how she knew exactly what he liked best and what his favorite spot was, because she was observing him as well. And then we had a woman who was sort of cognitively not always in the same place as we were, and she would, when the dog was there, as you can see in this picture, she would just go on and on and on about this was actually a house somewhere in a different place, and her brother was living there, and her brother was just doing this, and then he was going to come back, and she was going to do this, and so she was telling him all these stories, and you can see in his face, by his sort of, he has a relaxed mouth and his tongue is slightly coming out, so he's fine with it. You know, she can go on, and he will sit there and listen to her, and then she will invite him to sit on her lap. She's quite fragile, but he'll sit on her lap and sort of sit on her lap anyway, and talk to him. And again, this is significant because with humans, it's not always the case that you can sit there patiently and listen to hours and hours of nonsense perhaps and listen to it over and over again, and people might leave or even avoid a person like that. In particular, other nursing home residents. Nursing home residents among each other are often really quite mean, and so it's a problem also in terms of developing human relationships. But the dog doesn't really care so much. So I'm coming towards the end of the presentation. I want to briefly look at why does Alvin actually do what he does? This thing of looking at the human and trying to figure out what do you want me to do in this situation right now? Oh yeah, we're playing hide and seek. Oh no, I just have to sit here and listen to you. That's fine. So how does he know what the person wants? Well, I started, and you actually started by saying that it's already 20 years ago, but still. I had some training in biology, several years actually, and so I turned to some of the references that I used in my studies then. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with this literature, but I found an interesting statement by ethologist Nico Tinbergen. And he felt that researchers should be interested in these four things: evolution of behavior, adaptation, causation, and ontogeny, or development. And adaptation, in his point of view, was really about adapting to environmental conditions in order to breed and to sort of continue the species. But I sort of gave it a slight twist because I was also using some more recent literature on dog behavior and human-dog interaction. But in my analysis of the photographs and looking at the specific relationships, I tried to use these four criteria as categories. So when we look at the literature on evolution of behavior in relation to dogs, there are some studies, because there is some talk of dogs are really sort of domesticated wolves, and some of the studies try to prove that humans and dogs co-evolved, and that they're actually not like dogs, not like wolves, and that even when wolves grow up with humans, they display very different interaction with humans and very different behavior. And dogs rely far more on humans to understand what they're supposed to do in a certain situation. And there's some studies, for instance, where they have a plastic box with food in it, and they have dogs trying to open it and wolves trying to open it. And wolves will try to open it until they fall over. And dogs will try for a bit, then they'll look at their human and sort of ask, am I supposed to do this? And stop. So there's a difference between dogs and humans, and in these experiments it's really visible that there is a relationship that has evolved over thousands and thousands of years of cohabitation between dogs and humans. Another example that's quite well known is referential sort of looking. When something is hidden and dogs can't figure out where it is, people can point, and the dogs will understand which direction they have to walk in order to obtain their toy or treat or whatever. So there are some development of communicative skills between dogs and humans that helps dogs to work in these kind of situations, because they use this kind of referential looking to figure out what the relationship with this human can be. Like in this situationship, now you see, earlier you saw him looking at her, trying to read of her face, or maybe she was going to look at the right hand. And here he's looking at, and you can actually see that she's looking at the same hand. So my guess is that there's a treat in there. It's also important that research has found that dogs can recognize facial expressions, so they know whether it's safe or not to approach a human and to build a relationship, for instance. Well, adaptation, again, refers to this instance of referential looking. And an experiment that's interesting in this context is where they used a fan with paper on it, so that it had movement but was also making noise. And the experiment was that a dog and his owner had to approach it. And in one instance, the dog owner had to look very concerned about approaching the fan. And in the other situation, the dog owner was just walking to the fan. And they saw that the dog was looking at the owner to figure out whether it was a dangerous thing that they were approaching or not. And when the owner looked concerned, the dog wouldn't approach either. When the owner was fine, the dog approached. So I use this example to show how this works in the nursing home situation, where this woman who wasn't really very mobile or walking at all, she really wanted to go for a walk with a dog. To go for an actual walk with a dog was totally out of the question, because she couldn't walk more than a few meters, and also did it very slow. So she walked from the red sofa basically to almost where she was standing now, and she did it very slow, step by step. So for the dog it was a very uncomfortable walking rhythm, because there was so much stopping and resting. So you can see here that he's looking at her, requesting cues about the walking speed, and eventually sort of lies down and looks at his owner to ask for instructions, and then gets up again and walks with her in a sort of very slow, arrhythmic speed. Then causation. I really like this picture because, well, people say dogs smile. I think that this would probably qualify for it. But again, you can see that the dog is very relaxed, and he's just listened to a few stories, and then he's come and sat on her feet to claim his reward. And his owner also says that basically this dog is pretty egoistic. So it works for him because he's in the middle of everyone's attention, and he likes that, so he will work for it. And as I mentioned before already, they are sentient animals. They can, there's now even studies where dogs, I think, are used to detect people's diseases. So that probably qualifies as sentient as well. There is a sort of a relationship or an anticipation that cannot be seen, not even, I guess, in the images that we have. But it's also important that when I started talking about the benefits of animal-assisted therapy, but that the dog actually, in the biochemical sense, also benefits from this experience, and also experiences pleasure, which is a part of why he wants to do this. Then the development was the fourth aspect. I already mentioned the training and the motivation of the dog. Breed is another one that is not unimportant. You can achieve a lot with training and motivation, but some animals are bred for specific purposes and for specific human activities, like dogs that are used for hunting or for searching, and they will require different training because they interact with humans in a different way. In animal-assisted therapy, you see quite a few of these dogs, also smaller dogs. If you think of dogs that assist people with visual impairments, is also a particular breed that is preferred because of the relationship between human and animal. So to come to some sort of a conclusion, basically what we found with our mostly visual data, the photographs and the observations, was that Most of the things that they found in the medical studies, we found as well, only we had the story with it, I guess. We had more depth, and because we focused a little bit more on the dog, we could also consider why the dog was maybe a better animal than, say, a rabbit or a lizard. In terms of care, it's important that the dog constitutes an actor in the care relationship, just like the nurses and the family. And again, to go back to this idea of objection, there is a feminist approach to institutional care that claims that in a caring relationship, the notion of objection can be reverted, so the body can be redeemed. And I think that the examples before show that the dog plays a very significant role in providing especially a sort of multi-sensory and embodied stimulation. The dog also encourages more mobility, communication, sensory connection, and memory work, where people talk about their past. And the mobility is very significant, because some people who lost body functions, there was one woman in another nursing home where the dog worked who lost the function of her entire arm, and through working with the dog, she was so encouraged to feed the dog his treat with that arm that after some weeks of work she could use the arm again, and that had not been achieved before with the work with the nurses. So it's a different approach, perhaps, to using one's body. I think the study also shows, as I've repeatedly said, what the dog as a dog can contribute, and that it's worth considering how can you use dogs, and how can you also train dogs and train the relationship between dogs and humans in order to use them for work in nursing homes, in order specifically to improve human well-being. Of course, you might say, yeah, that's all very well, but we don't have so many volunteers who would go every week to work in a nursing home, and also dogs stink and have all these germs. So let's try robot. And this is from Australia, a cat and a seal, and I know in Holland I think they've started using seals, and in Sweden they've started using cats, and it's a possibility, but I think there's limitations to a scenario of a robot Alvin, and I think the photos actually already answer that question. There's a specific relationship between the dog and the human. It's not a scripted interaction. I don't know how well you can program these robot animals actually, and what kind of artificial intelligence might be included so that they can adapt to 60 different residents' preferences. But also the fact that the dog does smell and feel and responds, that is the factors that contribute to the memory work. That is how people remember, oh yeah, I used to have a dog and we used to do such and such. And that is how they attain a sense of self-identity and achievement as well. And again, I'm not sure how well this robot cat would work in that context, but maybe you have more experiences with that. And I really wanted to leave a sort of an open end with these new developments here, because that is currently the way that we're going, and I think it would be a shame. So I think we have some time for questions. Half an hour? No, 20 minutes.
20 minutes. So thank you very much. Thank you, Bettina.
You're welcome. Sorry about the mix-up with the presentations.
Etwas Licht?
Yes, let's have everyone awake again. If you fell asleep, I didn't see it anyway, it was too dark.
I just want to say, once saw those seals in Adaptation, it was kind of awkward to me what it actually works, because the inhabitants were very happy. Yeah.
I know they are. Yeah.
I'm just interested in knowing practical information. Maybe I just didn't get it, but does this nursing home regularly work with dogs, or was it just during your research? And if it was just for your research, then did it have an effect, or did it have an effect on
Well, it's actually a very good question, because the reason why I mentioned before that the medical studies recruited respondents using different criteria was because I meant to say that we didn't do that also because the dog regularly visited the nursing home. And if we were to say we only want to study these 10 people because they fulfill certain criteria, it would mean that the other regulars who are also waiting for the dog would be deprived during the duration of our study. So we just followed the dog in his regular interaction. And actually to this day, it's Tuesday, right? So he would have gone this morning to spend time in the nursing home. Yeah, so it's an ongoing project. Not for me, but for the dog.
Thanks for a fantastic paper, Bettina. I have two, really, it's marvelous paper. I have two questions. The one is, I really admire the depth and Vielgestaltigkeit of your data.
Diversity?
Diversity, no, I weiß nicht, yeah. So I thought you had put considerable fantasy in developing methods. And I was just thinking about what kind of methods do we really need to do multi-species ethnography. Maybe you can say something.
Yeah,
about
well,
that.
actually, I've been reading some literature on that, and maybe not specifically about multi-species, but if you want to have a more depth understanding of what is happening, definitely something like participant observation is a good thing to do, because, I mentioned that to do surveys in this case would have been out of the question. I don't think we would have gotten any reliable or any data at all. And even the interviews was very difficult. We thought, we need to know from people, and here they have to say in their own words how they feel, but we didn't get that information. And with using the 900 pictures, I think you can see really well by facial expressions and sort of bodily compositions how people feel, what they're. I mean, it's not just about whether they have high or low blood pressure, but how that translates into a specific emotion. And being there with the dog, you can also see in which context it happens. So you don't have the images removed from the situation. I mean, you do have the images removed from the situation, but you also know what the contextual information is. So I think in multi-species research, you need to become part of the scenery as well in order to understand it. And I was also concerned about, could I, as a now social scientist, really say something about the behavior of a dog? And I was very comforted by a study on pigs, where a biologist conducted a study on pig behavior, and she had a group of farmers, a group of biologists, and something else, and students. Students are always used, I guess, for regular people. And she found that everyone had the same observations, more or less. So I found that very comforting. And again, I mean, if you look at what ethology really is, it's observations. And I remember even from school the famous example of the seagull rolling the egg back into the nest. I don't know if you had that as well in your biology classes, but of course that information, which is now a well-established theory, is based on humans observing birds and doing it for a long time. So it's not an unusual way of measuring animal behavior. But we think, because we're social scientists, and then of course there's this question of, aren't we treating animals like humans when we're conducting observations, and aren't we projecting emotions into the animal that we cannot really be sure about? But then if I go to Africa and observe people there, then am I not doing the same thing? Am I not projecting my thoughts into a situation that I have no knowledge about? And still, it's a very respected field of science.
But there is yeah, there is this danger. We don't want to anthropomorphize or vermenschlichen the dog. That was actually my second question. I was thinking about what kind of practices besides giving a name and what kind of relations are really constituting an animal as individual? What is it?
Well, I think naming is not the practice that makes the animal an individual. It's a practice that establishes a relationship between the human and the individual and makes it sort of part of the home setting. But the individual is, well, it's a good question. I think the specific behavior that you observe of the animal and the animal in relationship to others is about individual practice. And I was just mentioning a book by a biologist, Mark Beckhoff. It's called Emotional Lives of Animals, and he has some really interesting examples of animal identities, I guess, that are kind of unexpected. There's one observation on how magpies grieve. And you would think, oh, they're just birds and they do, they nest and fly off to warmer countries to feed and come back and nest again and stuff. But by observing them, you could really see that the birds relate differently to each other. And when one died, and I think it was as a result of a road accident, the others hung around and came back in a grieving process. So I think it is through that observation that you can detect the specific animalness, I guess. And there are similarities, but there are similarities between humans as well, and still we claim that we have a self-identity.
I was thinking of something else. There's a very interesting study by sociologist Stefan Hirschauer about pregnancy and how the newborn is becoming an individual. And I thought it would be very interesting to just compare. And it's also very detailed, nuanced description of relationships and practices occurring that kind of produce this newborn as an individual in a certain process.
Is he referring also to Melanie Klein in psychoanalysis?
No, not at all. Completely free of psychoanalysis. But that, I think it would be interesting to kind of compare your study with his. It would be very eye-opening.
Yeah, I think, one of the things, I guess, where we see a problem in ascribing a sort of self-identity or individuality is on account of emotions. And there's interesting sort of behavioral and evolutionary studies that show that the difference between humans and animals is not so much in kind as in gradation. So biologically, apparently, it makes no sense to think that animals should not have emotions, since we evolved from them somewhere. It's just a matter of maybe the kind and the extent. And again, the book by Mark Beckhoff is really very revealing, where he goes through different kinds of science experiments and observations in order to bring across that specific point.
I've got two questions. The first concerns your research. I also didn't quite get some basic information about your study, like how long did you research, where did you do your research, how did you get access, things, just to get sort of a more complete, like who took the pictures, which I find interesting then when you come to interpreting them. Yeah. So, like questions around the study, that would be the first one. Oh, and maybe you just want to answer it.
Yeah. Well, we were incredibly lucky to have access to the nursing home and to the dog, because there's sort of different gatekeepers that you would normally encounter. When I think of the situation in Groningen, where I live, there's not an institutionalized practice of volunteers going into nursing homes with their animals. Although it's now, people try to institutionalize it by offering very expensive training, like also in Germany. But so you would need to find first an organization and a volunteer and a nursing home and request informed consent from all of those. Well, in this particular case, the dog owner is my father, And he has a dog school, and he's been training these kind of dogs for years. And he also trains dogs to work in kindergartens, to work in schools, in a sort of teacher. I can't remember what the program is, but there's a sort of teacher training program where teachers bring dogs into school classes. And he's been working with dogs in nursing homes for the past 10 years, I think. So as I became more interested in looking at aging in nursing homes, and I was familiar with a study that he'd done with a German student for a Diplomarbeit in the past, I thought that this would be a really great opportunity to try and do some observational data. And the nursing home, they were so happy with the work of the dogs that they just couldn't wait for people to come and study it and tell other people about it. So we obtained consent from them as well. And the photos were all taken by my father as well over the past years. So we had access to the pictures from the 2007, I think, onwards. And so I went from Groningen basically every other week to drive to this particular nursing home with a research student to conduct observations over several months.
Thank you. And the second one, I'm afraid it's not a dog-centered question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
But you know, I think that's really it's challenging, and it's so difficult to overcome our concepts and thinking like what should that be, a dog-centered approach, but my question is that's I confess my question is not dog-centered at all. It's about the residents. And
they were also in the picture, so I might be able to answer the question.
They're so desperate when they wait for the dog, and given that there's not much communication between them and that they're rather mean to each other and like wanting a sofa for themselves, and when the dog comes, and it's only one dog, but it's like 10 people waiting for that dog, and the one is like wanting to have the dog on her bed. So isn't that increasing competition between the residents?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Maybe a robot, Alvin, like a solution to that problem. Just give them like 10 robots, because that would be. Of course, I agree. That like the real Alvin is the real Alvin, and a robot is a robot, and that's a huge difference. But given like money constraints, and then. But the question is.
It's a good question, and I think it's actually exactly why they use robot animals is to address that specific issue that people can. And they even have stuffed animals also on the units, and people will sit there with a teddy bear and stroke the teddy bear, and then I guess the robot teddy bear or cat or whatever is an upgrade because it has some kind of interaction. And so yes, there is competition. And actually in our interviews I had to smile because it is one of the women was talking about that, how there's always competition, and how when one resident is interacting with the dog, the other ones will already try and sort of get the dog's attention. But the dog is very well trained, so he will stick with it. But we talked about this issue with the staff, and they actually felt that the time that the residents did spend with the dog was fine, because also some of them couldn't pay attention to the interactions for too long, so they enjoyed it whilst they were there. And others, they could have sat with the dog for the entire day. That is true. But most of them also understood when the dog had to go, and they would say things like, "Oh yeah, you have to go for a walk," or "You're a very busy dog," or something like that. So it wasn't that there was more stress that we could observe or that the staff observed. So from what we heard from the staff, it seemed that the benefits were definitely very visible, and that none of the staff talked about competition among each other. Usually people were seated either around a table doing their own thing, not being very aware of what other people were doing, and then the dog would sort of see who was interested. Or in some of the units they would sit a little bit more apart, and then they might not even see the dog interacting with other residents unless he was very close by. But it is a good point, and yes, there was some competition, but it didn't affect the situation very negatively as far as we could tell.
Yeah, but I would really be interested in some sort of comparison with the robot animals, because I had some immediate thoughts, as probably everyone, why this would be different.
Yeah.
It would be like, I don't know, the sort of unexpected moment of a reaction that is
I would be really interested as well.
Programmed by humans, but this just my back of my head thought. So I would be really interested in sort of, thinking those things together and have another sort of.
I would be really interested as well, and I think not just to see what the exact interaction is between the robot animal and the resident, but I think also in terms of looking more critically at the broader conditions of introducing robot animals, because it's not just about the robot animal being in the nursing home, but the whole system of volunteers going through the training with their dogs and spending their own personal time to help through their dog other human beings, that then is also totally blanked out. So I think you have to see the work with the dog also as part of the whole network. And so it's not just about replacing an actual animal with a robot animal. It does more in terms of the societal dimension of this kind of work. But yeah, I would be interested in seeing all of these relationships in comparison as well.
One last question?
I'm sticking to the sentence you talked about this particular dog and its dogness. And I'm working on a line build of technology building. I had the idea of like an animal, interactive, and so on. So. Can you make a difference between this particular dog and its dogness, and what is, how important is that particular individual dog for your work?
Well, I tried to highlight it in the presentation simply because most of our observations were with that dog, and the relationship that we observed were initiated by that dog and that particular human. There was another dog working on a different unit who worked very differently with people, but that was also in part because of the way that his human organized the interaction. So the other dog was introduced to the residents more in a sort of circular setting, and that it was more scripted. So they were playing ball and so forth, and there wasn't so much of a volunteer interaction between the dog and the resident. So that is why I was very specific in highlighting that what we saw here was really an outcome of the relationship between the dog and the human. But if I think of the literature from the medical sciences, where we did have sort of an unknown dog X who did some kind of scripted interaction, a lot of the outcomes were similar. So I think that similar relationships can be observed with other dogs as well. But the whole point is that it's important that the dog can bring his own agency into a relationship and impact the relationship just as the human can. Does that answer the question?
Yeah,
You're still thinking.
For a more systematic characterization, but perhaps I find it in these animal-assisted therapy literature.
Yeah, there isn't very much qualitative research that I've come across. People tend to work a lot with surveys in this kind of business, I guess.
So maybe if you would like to extend the discussion, I'm not sure if everyone received the invitation to join us to go to Haus am Walde afterwards, and then just bringing it up again. So, but first of all, would you please join me in thanking Bettina for her presentation. Of the very
You're welcome.